And after that woman yelled at me, I think I kind of adjusted it to make it visible from outside our home. Not because I like flags, I really don't, but I did want and do want Israeli friends and colleagues, teachers and students to know that I love them. And if the flag can convey that, I want them to see that. And if there's anyone who is hostile to Jews and to Israelis, I want them to target me too.
Welcome to What Came After. I'm your host, Manya Marcus. On What Came After, we'll take a look at the many ways people's lives have changed since the brutal massacre in Israel on October 7th, 2023. We'll be speaking to people around the world to learn how this profound moment in Jewish and global history continues to shift, shape, and change them. To learn more, please visit us at whatcameafter.com. Hello, we are recording on September 5th, 2025, and I'm seated here with Rabbi David Wolkenfeld. Thank you so much for joining me.
Really my honor. Thank you.
I would love for you to tell us where we are and what it is you do here.
Sure. So I'm the rabbi at Ohev Shalom congregation, which is an Orthodox shul in Washington, D.C. We are in the district, but we are the edge of the district, very close to the border with Silver Springs. So that's sort of how we're situated here. It's a community that is to a large degree comprised of government employees, civil servants. There's some shuls downtown, which are comprised of interns and senators.
A little more transient, perhaps.
Correct. Or much, much more wealthy. And then of people who make their careers in government service, but they want a little more room, but they want to stay in the district. This is where many of them will end up.
Well, I actually want to come back to that point a little bit later because you have a very politically informed and engaged congregation. I'm sure that poses some challenges and, of course, brings some joys to your work.
Indeed, yes.
But before we go there, I do want to ask you about October 7th. That's the focus of the podcast. And it's always interesting for me and for listeners to hear, especially for observant people, how and when they found out, since, of course, this happened on a Chag, a holiday, and our phones were off.
Yeah. So I found out really right when I arrived at the congregation. We have a member of the shul who was a senior advisor in the Biden administration, and he had been up for hours and been on the phone with the president and with senior members of the administration, and he'd been in and out of shul all day. And so he was aware and told some others, and so we knew fairly early. Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer is a member of the congregation, and we asked him to address the congregation and inform everyone of what had occurred right before Torah reading that morning. And he had also already been in touch with various contacts that he has, and so he was informed. There are a few others who knew, family in Israel, medical professionals who kept their phones on and then heard from their relatives in Israel. And so a number of people had sort of independently found out, but many people did not know until we told them that morning.
Can you imagine how it would have been different if you were in a role where you didn't have these kind of political affiliates? Not that you would not have found out, because everybody did somehow, but that you wouldn't have had someone to address the congregation explaining the enormity of what had happened. Did you have a sense of what would I have said if I had needed to go up to bat?
That's interesting. I would say, even though we had informed people updating the congregation, I think it was a day or two until I really had a sense of the scale and the scope. And I think maybe the next day I visited somebody who had broken his foot or something. So I just went by his house to visit him, and he had people in his home who had the television on. And so he was sort of telling me some of the images he had seen, which, like you can hear something, there was an attack, missiles, kidnapping, and then to actually, the scale and the scope and the ferocity of the attacks weren't really clear to me, at least for several days. So I think if I had been the one to inform, I couldn't have done it with the confidence or with the knowledge of the people who did that informing. But in fact, I think we really didn't have a sense of really what had happened for a day or two later. What did fall upon me was to determine the religious tone that we were going to adopt. There were congregations that really pivoted away from celebrating Yom Tov altogether. And maybe if we had known a bit more, maybe we would have, made that choice. But that's not the choice that we made. The attitude that we adopted, and I think I explicitly said this, was there are people who are fighting right now so that we can be here observing Yom Tov and celebrating. And so there were certainly moments over the next 48 hours or so, or 36 hours, that were sad and somber as we were aware that history was changing. A lot of death and destruction had occurred and would occur, but we also felt that it was our task to celebrate Yom Tov, and we had festive hakafot, and Simchat Torah was observed and celebrated in our congregation, despite the shadow hanging over us and despite some moments of somberness and sadness that we introduced.
So I've been living a Jewish life for quite a long time, but sometimes I still get this sort of Jewish stage fright of, do I know what's going on? The hakafot are where we sort of dance in the circle with the Torah, correct?
Correct. We learned of the attacks the morning of Shemini Atzeret, and then that night we celebrated Simchat Torah and danced with the Torah, and we did so again the next morning. And then it was that evening when we all turned on our phones and watched the news and saw the images, and that's when we kind of had a fuller sense of the scale and the enormity and the ferocity of the violence.
I want to share something interesting, which is that we interviewed a rabbi in Amsterdam who said that most of his congregation is not observant Israelis. So they really understood the magnitude of what had happened. And he said that they sort of coined this concept of "we will dance again" in the context of dancing with the Torah right away, separate from Nova. My question for you on that is, did you detect any kind of diminishment of enthusiasm in the dancing itself?
For sure. Like people were traumatized and sad and aggrieved, and some people, I think, stayed away. I don't think I would have articulated as "we would dance again," because I don't think I knew about Nova at the time, but it was a sense of Israel is under threat. There are Jews who aren't able to celebrate this holiday, whose holiday was interrupted. We have the ability to celebrate this holiday, and we're going to celebrate this holiday. It's not the same, but there was a period of time where synagogues across the world were shut down because of COVID lockdowns.
Yeah.
There was one hospital in Israel where people were recuperating from COVID. They were coming out of their COVID sickness, and they'd all had the virus and were immune. And so they gathered and had tefillot and minyanim, and they were reading the Torah there. And it was just so meaningful to me that somewhere in the world, the Torah portion of the week is being read, that Jews are gathering and praying, that someone's saying Kaddish. It was such a source of comfort for me when everywhere else in the world that was really primarily impossible. So this was like our turn, right? In Israel, they couldn't celebrate. So here in DC, we really could. And so it felt like we had the responsibility to be the Jewish communities that were able to observe these holidays and celebrate them.
It's really interesting because the feeling that I had immediately after October 7th was that it was my job to share in the grief and to feel somber for a long time. But it seems like there's something in Judaism, I don't know if it's theology or just practice, where people who can should. Are there theological underpinnings there?
I'm sure there are, but that's certainly the attitude that I felt. Maybe the theological underpinning is if we succumbed to every occasion for mourning, the whole calendar would be filled with mourning. There's a line we say, one of the poems of lament, the keynote that we recite on Tisha B'Av, this day of somber mourning for the tragic episodes of Jewish history. So we mourn the destructions of the temple in Jerusalem that took place on the 9th of the month of Av. But we also mourn other tragic events in Jewish history that didn't occur on the 9th of Av, including the massacre of the Jewish communities in the Rhineland during the period of the First Crusade, which took place on or near the holiday of Shavuot. And there's a line in one of the poems that says something like, we don't add additional days of mourning. We have enough days of mourning. If we added too many others, like, when would we not mourn? And certainly we're not going to cancel a holiday like Shavuot because of a tragic event that occurred in that holiday. So something that we circled back to 1 year later when we had to figure out how we would commemorate the massacre and the start of the war. And the decision we made here was to really focus that mourning and that sadness and that grief in the Yizkor memorial prayers that are already part of the Shemini Atzeret observances, and that we would then hopefully in that way free up the rest of the holiday to be what they're meant to be, what they're supposed to be, which are festive days. There's a story that I heard from one of my colleagues who was talking with a 5-year-old or 3-year-old about the Jewish holidays, and he mentioned Simchat Torah as one of the holidays, and she said, "Oh, but Simchat Torah is a sad day, not a happy day." And he was so shocked and taken aback. But of course, if you're 3 or 4 or 5, your association of Simchat Torah is the war and this terrible attack, right? And so
that's wild.
So that is what we don't want to have happen, right? We want to, of course, remember. Jews have to remember, and we have to have space for mourning, but we have holidays, and we need to preserve them and maintain them.
What was the shift like for you, if there was one, from the kind of pastoral care that you did prior to October 7th and the pastoral care that your congregation needed after, or did you not see much of a difference?
I started working at this congregation July of 2023. This was
Oh,
my
wow.
first year in this position. And so who knows?
Who knows
I
what?
don't really know what my first year was going to have different priorities, maybe different focuses.
So this is the only world that you know in this congregation.
In this congregation, this is really the world that yeah.
And how have the pastoral needs been? What have people needed from you or from other congregants? What have they looked for?
A few things come to mind. One, people needed permission and framing to celebrate. Like October 7th was Shemini Atzeret Simchat Torah. 1 week later was Parshat Breshit, which was a bar mitzvah parsha here. And so
Parshat Breshit is at the beginning of the Torah, for those who don't know. Yeah.
And happened to be a lovely young man, was celebrating his bar mitzvah that Shabbat. Typically, right, during the summer months when many people are away, if you have a summer birthday, you're going to push off the bar mitzvah, the bat mitzvah until the end of the summer when everyone comes back from vacation or from summer camp. And then you're not going to have a bat mitzvah right in the midst of the holidays because we don't have the capacity necessarily to convene that. And so it tends to be that the weeks right before, or often even the weeks right after the holiday season, we have a string of families. And actually my daughter had a bat mitzvah in November, so a little bit later.
November 2023.
November 2023, yes. And the line that we used again and again was, this is a really, really hard week to make a simcha, a hard week to celebrate, but a really great day for another proud Jew to take ownership of his or her tradition and to join their place in the Jewish people. That was one distinct pastoral need that we felt, and I think that was sort of a tone that the synagogue adopted to help people celebrate in the midst of all of this really destabilizing and tragic news that we were all absorbing. Another pastoral need was helping people navigate their new relationship with their communities, people in public schools who had some challenging interactions with peers and even with teachers, some of which made it to the news. We have a number of university professors in the congregation who are handling the earthquake on campus, with campus professionals, Hillel professionals, and I hope the synagogue was able to be a source of support for them as their world was really much less stable than it had been. We had families who were challenged by significant political differences between generations of the families. Some of our strongest, most fervent pro-Israel families have children or grandchildren who have expressed pretty strong opposition to Israel and to the war, and that emerged pretty early on as well. And that was certainly a pastoral challenge facing those families.
In terms of the role that you were asked to play, were you providing support to the older generations? Were you convening a kind of mediation across generations?
The people I had the most contact with were the older generations. The pastoral interventions I had in those particular instances, at least early on, in the first months after the war, were the older generations and trying to give them some framework for preserving loving family relationships over really, really significant and fraught political differences. Months later, the pastoral intervention is a little bit different. And now, in addition to that dynamic, there's also the dynamic of not just children, but adults in the community who feel political alienation from Israel and certainly from its government's policy and conduct in the war, and helping them figure out their place in the Jewish community in light of those feelings.
So you used the word earthquake to describe what happened on campus. I think a lot of us felt that in the general atmosphere. But the thing about an earthquake is that it's not totally unpredictable. There are the fault lines already, right? Were you surprised by what happened after October 7th?
Yes and no, because the fault lines are there. And I remember conversations I had 20 years ago, actually, saying that, Israel's place in the family of nations among the Western democracies is really fraught. And the Palestinian issue is an existential threat to Israel's place in the Western democratic world.
Where were you having this conversation?
Like shooting the breeze with friends. Like
that's so prescient.
Well, I said a lot of things. Some of them were, some of them have panned out,
not, yeah.
And actually, that was something I said in 2004, 2005. And for a really long time, I thought, I guess I was wrong about that. I guess this issue can kind of fester and be on the back burner for years and years. And I guess there is no fallout. I don't know, right? If you wait long enough, eventually predictions, might bear fruit. I could not have anticipated the degree of hostility and how quickly that emerged. I had also really, really discounted anti-Semitism as a potent political force on the American left. I didn't see it, and I see it now. Not that all opposition to Zionism or Israel is anti-Semitic, but there is anti-Semitism on the political left, and it can be seen, and I felt it and saw it, and that surprised me.
You wrote something that really moved me at some point in the last year. I think somebody may have been yelling "Free Palestine" at you
Yes.
on the way to shul.
Yes.
Please free Palestine, ... From what, right? You can repeat it, but something about how you and your family are not into signs.
Yeah. Yeah.
But did you put a sign out?
I did put up a sign. There was like a little Israeli flag that was like in our window. And after that woman yelled at me, I think I kind of adjusted it to kind of make it visible from outside our home. Not because I like flags. I really don't. Yeah, if anything, these last months have made me more skeptical of nationalism as a way of being in the world, as a way of thinking, as a way of organizing human beings. But I did want and do want Israeli friends and colleagues, teachers and students to know that I love them. And if the flag can convey that, I want them to see that. And if there's anyone who is hostile to Jews and to Israelis, I want them to target me too.
That was what was so interesting about
Yeah.
it to me. It really hit me in the kishkis. I don't know why, but your online and your in-person demeanor are very matched. You're very even. You're just very even keel. And I think the last line of that was, if someone is going to come and target Jews, I don't want them to miss me. Can you say more about that sentiment?
I remember, I'll say two things. One is that large thoroughfare that you drove up when you came to this building.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's a very heavily trafficked road, and there's a family in the shul that has a home on that road, and they have displayed an Israeli flag very, very prominently in front of their home, and they've had to replace it, I think, well over a dozen times. Because
Wow.
it's been stolen, it's been vandalized. So I'm not the big, flag person for some of the reasons I alluded to, but I feel, wow, what is the zechut to this family that they have been able to demonstrate what they believe in such a prominent way, and they've suffered for it, and they've been committed to that. So that's like one feeling that I have. Yeah.
I hope my mother is listening. She doesn't know what zechut means.
So, thank you.
Please tell us.
What a merit! What a merit! If you believe in something and you don't have any cost for that belief, you really don't know how deep and how committed you are to something. I see this as a rabbi, whatever cause it is, whatever issue, are you willing to take heat within your congregation? Are you willing to lose the support of some of your members to stand up for a value or an ideal or some position you're taking? And that's how I see it in my professional life. But I think it's true in our personal lives. If you're willing to suffer for something, then you know that you actually are committed to that. Not that the suffering is good, not that we want the suffering, but it clarifies what we really stand for and what we really believe in. And so it's a merit in that for their solidarity with Israel that they had that cost. I thought this also in a much darker way when the Chabad shluchim in India were killed in that terror attack several years ago.
Maybe over a decade ago now.
In Mumbai, yeah, it was well over a decade ago. And I thought, what is a zechut? What a merit that these Chabad rabbis have, that people who think of Jews in positive and negative ways thought of them. That is a real merit, something really, really special.
I have to say, I find that really fascinating for a couple reasons. The first is that when we were in Europe, we did hear that rabbis had advised congregants not to display Jewish insignia in certain areas. The second is that I know that you have a very profound relationship to loss via the Holocaust in your family history. And so when I think about suffering in Judaism, I think there's a limit to what we should endure and that we should not put our bodily safety on the line.
I agree. I don't think we should put our bodily safety on the line, and I don't think we should embrace suffering as an ideal. I do think, though, that Chabad should be proud that anti-Semites target them, right? Which is different from wanting to be targeted. I'm obviously not giving anyone safety advice, right? And you should protect yourself and be prudent in all sorts of ways. And our synagogue is very prudent in all sorts of ways and in protecting the building and protecting our membership as best we can. But to symbolize Judaism, to symbolize the Torah is something that Jews do in the world. And my experience, actually, most of the time, being identifiably Jewish in public, wearing a yarmulke kippah in public with my children. We're a very identifiably Jewish family when we go out into the world. And I think 9 out of 10 interactions that elicits from people are positive, which I'm really proud of and happy about. And then sometimes they're negative ones too, but that's just the flip side of that same coin.
I think that if I were on, flag change number 3, 4, 5, I would probably say to my husband, maybe this is posing a greater threat than we had thought. Now, this is something that you've really felt in your community in terms of bodily harm and threat. When Sarah Milgram and Yaron Lashinsky were murdered several months ago, this community really understands the stakes. Can you speak a little bit about that event from your own perspective and from a pastoral and communal perspective?
Yeah, I found out because a friend texted me to say something like, solidarity with you, or something, we're thinking of you, hope you're okay. And I was, like what? I checked the news and the reports were coming in, and we have members of the congregation who are very closely impacted. Somebody who has a leadership role at the museum is in the community. The people who work for the AJC are in the community. And we found out that there was a photographer in the community who was photographing the event. So really direct personal connections. And then also people who knew the victims as well through their various professional circles. Because we've already had a pretty robust security posture, there was not much that we shifted in terms of the security stance of the synagogue. And it was actually when I worked in Chicago, 2018, I believe it was 2018, our synagogue was firebombed. It was a very incompetent
Yes, now I remember
arsonist, right?
the incompetence.
He threw like 3 Molotov cocktails against the synagogue's windows, and they shattered against the windows and burned out on the ground in the alleyway.
I do recall this, yeah.
We knew because we saw the evidence the next day, and then we saw on the security camera what had happened. Thankfully, there too, we had a pretty robust security posture with an attitude of constant improvement. And so it wasn't like a radical, oh my goodness, now we have to take security seriously. We had always taken security seriously. We continued to make ongoing improvements. And that was true here as well. Like, we take security seriously here. We did before, we did after. And I think that was a helpful thing to people to hear, that they didn't notice a major difference in before there were no guards, now there are guards. Before there was open access to the building, and now everything is shut down. No, there was people knew that we took security seriously before. They saw that afterwards without too much of a visible outward change. And I think that was reassuring.
Did you sense an internal shift, that people were more scared or more withdrawn?
I'd say personally, I am more likely to second guess myself whenever I am tempted to discount a security restriction on some conduct. So, everything is a balance, right? Your openness versus safety, and encouraging newcomers and visitors. Part of our mission as a synagogue is to be open and welcoming and embracing in that way. And obviously, the more open you are, the more risk that takes on. And after those murders, I am much less confident. Like, I take my temperature of what feels safe and comfortable to me, and then I wonder, is that really the right balance? And fortunately, it's not my decision alone. There's a committee that makes those decisions. The board is ultimately responsible to make those decisions. We consult with experts. There are other synagogues in our region across the country that are all weighing these same issues. But I know I'm much less confident in my own gut feeling than I was before.
I think there's some merit to that.
Yeah.
It's good to move by consensus with some of these things. So to go back to this Facebook post that you made where you sort of said, if Jews are being targeted, I don't want to miss that. I consider that one bookend. And then there was a Facebook post, I guess, that started to emerge more recently. You essentially posted things that now have been pretty critical of Israel, the blockade, the famine. To me, it felt like a tone shift. To you, maybe it doesn't. Can you talk about this recent era?
Rabbi Yosef Blau is a senior member of the American Orthodox kind of rabbinic establishment. He has been an educator, faculty member at Yeshiva University's rabbinical school for decades. He recently retired. Now he's, I think, emeritus there. He mostly lives in Israel. I actually know him through one of his sons, who was a teacher of mine in my first year in Yeshiva in Israel in 1998, and we've remained close and are still in touch to this day. He now is at a yeshiva where my son is studying. So the Blau family has been important teachers to me for decades. Several weeks ago, Rabbi Blau published an open letter signed by a number of other American Orthodox rabbis and religious leaders condemning the blockade of food into Gaza and also condemning settler violence in the West Bank targeting Palestinian civilians. You should all read the letter and you can see its language. I didn't sign the letter for a number of reasons, which I also shared on Facebook. And just a few weeks before the letter was published, I had, in the context of a sermon, I had shared with our congregation that I will not sign public letters anymore. I signed a bunch of them in my first years as a rabbi. I was so thrilled that anyone would ask me, to sign such a letter. It was like really fun. And there were some great letters that I was asked to sign, and I really, I stand behind those letters. Over time, I came to realize that everything that I say to my congregation, I weigh very, very carefully. And certainly the words in a sermon, like they're almost always edited by my wife and then reviewed by me again. And I
Who
really,
is a luminary in her own right.
she is, and an incredibly helpful editor, in addition to being a scholar and a Jewish professional of great significance. And so I just felt, given that I'm weighing my words so carefully, how can I sign someone else's words that I haven't tweaked and edited? And right, the nuances are going to be different. I'm not going to 100% agree. I'd rather stand behind the things I say and write than sign my name to a statement that I 80, 90, 70% agree with. I also came to realize that if I have a policy of I don't sign open letters ever, it also gives me protection against being pressured to sign letters that I don't want to sign. And that happens too, because sometimes there are we want every rabbi in the region to sign this letter, right? So I don't sign letters, and it gets me out of that kind of pressure as well. So I didn't sign the letter for some of those reasons. I didn't 100% agree with it.
But you did share it, and you said, if your rabbi is on this list, thank them.
Correct, because I mostly agree with it, and I'm glad it's out there, and I did share it and encourage people to read it and take it seriously. And the rabbis who signed it should be thanked. Some of them really displayed a lot of courage. I have a couple of colleagues whose names are on there. I know it was really hard for them to sign because I know how much they love Israel. And I know it must have been really, really hard to say anything critical about Israel in public. And that they did so speaks to their sincerity and how moved they are by the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And I just feel like they deserve that gratitude because they're certainly getting a lot of flack for it. And I know it was a hard choice for some of them to sign. So that's also why I wanted to encourage that gratitude. In terms of the shift, I don't know part of what made the October 7th attacks so horrendous and so morally indefensible and such a horrific, inhumane attack was that civilians were targeted. And to me, it was clarifying. Like, that's actually a core belief of mine, is efforts should be made to protect civilians in war. When civilians in West Bank and Area C are chased from their homes, when their property is destroyed, when they're even attacked and killed, that's the ethics of Hamas. If you attack civilians to pursue a political goal, if you think your national initiative and your national project can be advanced by attacks on civilians, that's the ethics of Hamas. If we condemn Hamas, we have to condemn our own brothers and sisters who engage in that kind of behavior as well.
How would you describe your Zionism or your relationship to Israel at this point?
I'm much less interested in ideologies. And so to be able to articulate a precise Zionist ideology seems much less important to me at this point in Elul 5785 in September 2025. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I could have articulated that. I can still articulate it, but it would have seemed more important and valuable to do so. It seems much less valuable to do so now. I think what's important to me now are who are the good guys, who are the people who are doing something productive, who maintain that distinction between civilian and combatant. People on either side who justify killing civilians, I think, are bad guys, to use a technical term. I don't care if they're Israeli or Palestinian, or if they're American leftists or Americans on the right. If they show disdain for civilian life, they're not people I want to be in coalition with. They're not on my side. And people who support coexistence, those are the good guys, and people who are against coexistence, I think, are quote unquote the bad guys. And again, I don't care if they're Zionist or anti-Zionist or on the Israeli side or the Palestinian side or the American left or the American right. There are 7 million Israeli Jews and 7 million Palestinian Arabs living between the river and the sea. All of them are going to stay there. All of them should stay there. Their fates are intertwined. And the Palestinian Arabs and the Israeli Jews will not live in peace, security, dignity, and freedom until the other side is also living in peace, security. And whether it's 2 states, 5 states, 1 state, 0 states, that's for them to figure out. I think it's our job to support whatever solution they come up with and they support. But anyone who is embracing and promoting eliminationist rhetoric or a program that has a dark fantasy of the other side disappearing is really, really harmful. And again, that's sort of a dark coalition of being against coexistence. So pro-Israel and pro-Palestine, it's a false dichotomy because Israeli Jews will not live in peace, security, freedom, and dignity unless and until Palestinian Arabs live in peace, security, freedom, and dignity. So it's actually, in the long range, even in the medium range, what's good for one is good for the other.
I want to tell you my reaction to all of this. I think that Jews who are totally immersed and ensconced in Jewish life sometimes forget what kind of an audience we have, what kind of scrutiny we're under. We interviewed somebody who's not Jewish in Poland, and she said, Israel is so small and it's always been a playground for bigger powers. I feel that way about Jews themselves, right? That we shape shift so much for the capitalists, for the communists, we're the dirty, we're the too clean, we're the rich, we're the poor, that sometimes I question the safety of making any kind of statement, certainly signing letters, even coming on podcasts and saying the word Israel and Hamas within the same 20-second span. What if somebody takes a soundbite and now you are fodder for position in the non-Jewish world that you really don't espouse? What would you say to that?
Yeah, that's really frightening. But maybe to answer your earlier question about the meaning of Zionism, one of the meanings of Zionism should be Jews taking responsibility for our own future and for ourselves, and to escape from being defined by others and to be used by others. And so if we are proud of this Zionist project, or we want to be proud of this Zionist project, then we have to invest in seeing it turn out. I think just even on a basic, just crass, self-interested level, you fight a war against an opponent, like those children, the orphaned children of Gaza, are going to be the neighbors of the children and grandchildren of our Israeli brothers and sisters forever, and their descendants forever, right? So sometimes you lose by winning, right? Sometimes a victory entails its own defeat if it just seeds the ground for the next round of retribution and violence and hatred. It's not easy to, right?
Sure.
Years ago, Shimon Peres had a line which I think about frequently. He said, we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, but there's no tunnel, right? It's not hard to imagine any number of peaceful outcomes,
but no pathway.
To get from here to there is impossible for me to imagine. But I do know that attacks on civilian life and civilian infrastructure is not a way to get to that outcome that is in the best interests of both Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews. At the beginning of the war, supporters of Israel here in America, we said, Israel's fighting a just war of self-defense. We took that message to Congress. We took that message to campus. Some of us even said, free Gaza from Hamas. That was our message. And the message of the pro-Palestine, anti-Israel side in America was, no, actually, October 7th is just a pretense for Israel to perpetuate a program of ethnic cleansing in Gaza. That was their message. We said it's a just war of self-defense. They said, no, that's just a pretense for ethnic cleansing. It was therefore, in that context, so disheartening when President Trump declared Gaza has been destroyed. It can't sustain civilian life anymore. We have to ship the Gazans elsewhere and, rebuild whatever, a Riviera on the Mediterranean. And then the Israeli cabinet endorsed the Trump plan, and I believe is still claiming to be working towards implementing some version of that plan, I think officially as an aim of the war. I see that as the government of Israel rejecting the pro-Israel argument that we had been making for the first year of the war, and in fact embracing the message of the anti-Israel activists. So that's also an earthquake. It's a very shaky place to be in because our efforts to support Israel and defend Israel have been undermined by statements made by the Israeli cabinet, by the Israeli prime minister, by the American president. It puts our activism in a very precarious place right now.
I mean, I see grief in you about this. This is a very difficult transition that has taken place, but it's just implicit to you. And I just want to keep bringing this up. Love of Israel, love for Zionism, a desire for the Zionist project to be successful, the disappointment that you feel coming from a place of intense love for this country is very different than a lot of what we see on the critical of Israel side.
Absolutely.
Is there anything that you can say maybe to those kids who at the beginning of the war felt so differently about it and their parents and grandparents were so upset? Something that connects where their grandparents sit with this and where the kids sat with this. I'll say one more thing. When you first put out what you put out about Rabbi Blau, I thought, oh no, this is just fodder for people who hate us. But now I see it might be a way of bringing in people who felt alienated. You're speaking two languages of this is a disappointment and a tragedy, and we need to improve upon it because this is a critical country for us to have a stake in.
Personally, I lived in Israel for 3 years. I have so many family and friends and colleagues and teachers and students who live there. It's impossible for me to imagine not caring anymore. It's impossible for me not to imagine not feeling this tremendous love for Israel. And I think that actually also kept me somewhat quiet, right? I just felt like what Israelis need from us right now is just love and solidarity and not advice, criticism, whatever. So yeah, a generation or two younger than me, like the Oslo Accords were signed the year of my bar mitzvah, right? So that's that like very formative years. And that's just a very different framing for Israel than somebody 10 or 20 or 30 years younger than me. In terms of the pro-Palestine activist left in America, Jewish and non-Jewish, it's really the same message that I would say to the pro-Israel activist community. If you want the people who live between the river and the sea, their children or their grandchildren, to have a better future, that's not a zero-sum game. The war will end when right-wing Israelis think that it's in Israel's best interest for the war to end. And there will be peace and coexistence when Israelis and Palestinians recognize that it's in their best interest to shift and pivot to a different type of relationship with one another. And so, tragically, I see a lot of the pro-Palestine activism in America as really being counterproductive. If you're fueled by venom and hatred, you're not going to achieve anything for anybody. And the same is true on the pro-Israel side. If you're fueled by hatred, right? Like, our fates are intertwined. People who have this deep love for Israel, that should extend towards Palestinians who are also residents of Eretz Yisrael and who are forever destined to be the neighbors of Israelis. And if you love Palestinians, then you understand that 7 million Israeli Jews are not going to disenfranchise themselves, and a way has to be found for Palestinian freedom and dignity and prosperity not to be seen as a zero-sum conflict with Israeli Jews. Religious Zionism has understood the Jewish return to the land of Israel to be somehow God's hand acting in history. And if we see that to be true, if we understand that the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel is the product of divine will, then we also have to recognize that God willed us to return to the land of Israel that was inhabited by the Palestinian people. And that's also part of that mission. You don't get to pick and choose, right? If God acts in history, this is also part of that history. We returned to a fully inhabited land. The religious Zionist mission is to figure out a way for the Jewish return to our homeland to be consistent with living in peace with our non-Jewish neighbors who share that homeland with us.
So my hope is that what you're saying right now will not push away the older generations who have a love for Israel that's just kind of in their bones, but instead will bring in people who don't know where to sit within the crisis and think that maybe the only place is outside of attachment to Israel. I really hope that that's some of the conversation, but I do want to ask how your congregation has responded to the public statements that you've now made in your own words about the direction of the war and the state of Israel.
This is perhaps more explicit than I've been in any sermon or right. So I don't know. Like if people listen to this, I don't know what they'll say. And as we mentioned before, the war started my first months serving this community, which is unfortunate for many, many reasons, but also, I don't have a track record of deep trust. They don't know me. I hope they've seen how sincere and how deep my connection to Israel is and to Israeli Judaism is. I hope they've seen and understand how pained I am by the Israeli losses in the war, by the deaths of so many of our Jewish brothers and sisters. When I talk about Israelis as our brothers and sisters, like it's a metaphor, but it's much more than a metaphor for many of us. Like actually, if it's not our brothers and sisters, it's our cousins or, right? Like, again, teachers, friends, colleagues, students. These are very, very strong relationships. And I hope that's apparent to them. And I hope they see the rest as being informed by my sense of what the Torah wants of us as Jews to think and believe and how we're supposed to be in the world.
I really want to thank you for taking the time. This has been a really meaningful conversation for me. Thanks for being so candid.
Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, and subscribe to What Came After wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us online at whatcameafter.com.
אלוהים תעזור לי להיות שוב תמים, להפסיק לחפש איך כולם אשמים, להאמין רק בטוב שבתוך החומות, כי בסוף לכולנו עיניים טובות בבקשה תעזור לי פשוט לאהוב בלי לדרוש חזרה, בלי לראות את הסוף, לא לחשוב כל הזמן מה יוצא לי מזה, כי בסוף מה ניקח אחרי שנלך. לקבל גם אותי, לאהוב באמת את כל מה שאני, גם את הנפילות הקשות ביותר, ואת כל הלילות שבחרתי לוותר. תעזור לי לשוב אל עצמי, להתיר חבלים שקושרים את ליבי, לא להיות עוד שבוי לבלי העולם, נשמה שנתת בי טהורה. דבר האחרון, שמור על אשתי, שמור עליה מכל, על ילדיי הקטנים, על עיניהם הטובות, שיהיו אהובים בעיני הבריות.